Welcome to Crossing Faiths. I'm John Pinna, and today we have a really interesting guest. We have the manager and senior legal expert at the Humanitarian Law Center in Israel, Mr. Eitan Diamond.
Yeah, nice to be here.
It's a pleasure. I mean, I'm so excited to have you. You're a South African Jew who lives in Israel. You're a legal expert, and you work very, very closely with the protection of civilians. And so to have that background and have someone that is able to kind of weigh in on some of these cases and the terminology that's being utilized in when it comes to Israel, Palestine, and so forth, you have a lot of sort of anchor points from your personal background. Maybe you just give us a little brief of who you are and how you got to the Humanitarian Law Center in Israel.
Okay, yeah, so I was born in the 1970s in South Africa, as you said. So it's actually quite a long story. I'll have to find a way to condense it.
I mean, apartheid South Africa,
yeah,
right?
exactly. Very much apartheid South Africa. And then in the early 1980s, my family moved to Israel. My parents wanted to leave South Africa because they were deeply opposed to the apartheid regime at the time. And they chose to move to Israel because they were also deeply committed to Zionism, to the idea of a Jewish state.
Mm.
And I suppose looking back after everything that we've witnessed in the ensuing decades since the 1980s, that might be, and some people have told me that's an ironic choice to move from apartheid to Israel. The reality was, at least for many Israelis, it was very different in the 1980s. I think some Palestinians already at the time would have pointed out to some uncomfortable similarities between the regime that we had left and the one that we moved to. But it took a while for that kind of realization to unfold. And really, in the beginning, I think it wasn't that difficult to reconcile the kinds of sentiments that drove my parents to leave South Africa and that I was sort of raised around. So, these notions about human dignity, about equality, it's kind of cosmopolitan values that were very much at odds with apartheid South Africa, and then to come to Israel, and over time, increasingly, um, the these values were challenged by the reality we were living in Israel, with the as the settlement enterprise mushroomed in Israel.
Sure.
Um,
How did your parents react to that? They moved, you had sort of this idea. We were talking earlier about some of your background and how you were raised as, in a Jewish home and were provided or established some values that were anti-apartheid. And then as you guys moved to Israel, as this was kind of evolving, because the 80s was it was a different time frame, right? There was quite a
It
bit.
was before the Intifada even, so yeah, it was,
Yeah. So how did the family react to that? And maybe just
yeah.
walk through like your the values that were instilled with you in your family, sort of liberal values. Like what was that? How would you sort of describe that identity?
Yeah. So, yeah, so absolutely. Liberal values. There was also a kind of religious approach, but it was a religion that was a sort of modern orthodoxy. So, and it was a version of that kind of approach to Judaism. The religion was Judaism. It was a version of that was really, I think, a kind of defining characteristic of it. The one that I think my mother, for example, would often refer to is this passage actually in the book of Genesis that talks about how we were all created in the image of, in Hebrew, that's B'Tselem, in the image of God. And I suppose captured in that is this idea that, people all have this kind of basic dignity, and this was very much the kind of reason why that approach to religion complemented opposition to apartheid and that kind of, and that wasn't I went to a religious school when I moved to Israel. They sent me to a religious school because of that kind of approach. But the emphasis in that school and in this wider society over the years as this kind of project of a greater Israel taking over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the territories that were occupied in 1967, that became really entrenched, particularly within religious circles in Israel. And the messages that were kind of prompt up to promote that project of the Greater Israel and kind of justifying the related dispossession of Palestinians, takeover of the land, the repression of these people, was not one that was emphasizing the idea that we're all created in the image of God, but rather a kind of nationalistic, so this kind of intertwining of religion with this idea that there's a chosen people, immediately putting everybody else in a different kind of class. It lent itself to a kind of tribalism, kind of closed attitude, the opposite of this kind of liberal cosmopolitan approach. And that was a tension that I grew up with. And fortunately, at least from my perspective, the messaging from home really prevailed. So, I mean, it had a negative effect on my attitude towards religion. So I know that religion can be all sorts of things, and sort of my mother's and father's kind of emphasis on we're all created in the image of God was something that I was exposed to. But the religion that I was seeing more was the one that promoted this idea of supremacy of one group over another, unfortunately, and it created a kind of emotional approach towards religion that drove me away from that. But I did retain this kind of idea that human dignity is a value that we have to champion, and that's, I mean, it was a roundabout route, but that eventually brought me to do the kind of work that I do now. So I'm an international lawyer, and the work that I do is focused on human rights and humanitarian law, and both of those bodies of law are really fundamentally linked to the idea that there's an inherent dignity in all people. We have to treat one another with care and respect, and that's put me in a kind of tension with the political realities in the country that I live in.
It's difficult, right? Because so you deal with dignity quite a bit, and then translating that into actual elements that you can actually execute or where you can institute protections is difficult sometimes, right? So and maybe the organization that you're in right now, the organization that you're working in, and I know you've worked as an advisor with child protection for UNICEF and a few other organizations. And how do you translate dignity of a human person into some kind of legal? Because there's like legal and then functional elements within the idea of translating that into something that benefits vulnerable populations. Like and if I know where we're at right now globally, so it's a loaded question a little bit, but this is the work that both of us do, right? So how do you do that? How do you take an issue of dignity, or take the idea of dignity and translate it into something that's actually going to impact people in the field?
Yeah. So the impact in the field is a real challenge, but the translation of the kind of abstract notion of dignity into more concrete terms is something that actually human rights law and humanitarian law does. So, I mean, these are bodies of international law that are really fundamentally informed by that concept. So they establish all kinds of restrictions on what a state can do in relation to people under its control, what you can do if you're a party to an armed conflict, to the opposing side, to civilians on the opposing side. And it's all informed in often very, very detailed, concrete terms by, at the core, this idea that we have to limit suffering to other human beings, that there's certain things that you just can't do to another person because of their dignity. So that's you have this kind of set of norms, legal norms that translate this abstract concept into concrete rules.
Right.
And so that helps a bit. But then your question was also about how you make this work in the real world. And there, unfortunately, there's a lot of work to be done between, describing the law, applying it to the reality on the ground, and then trying to get the relevant parties to actually respect that rule.
Right.
And that's a challenge, and it's really frustrating, and it definitely doesn't help when the most powerful actors are exhibiting increasingly a kind of indifference to this law.
Yeah, I was first exposed to this in Bosnia. And I'm in theater, and they were talking about ethnic cleansing, and they were yelling at me. The bosses were yelling, they're like, "You don't use ethnic cleansing because that's the word of their oppressors, right?" They say there's nothing legal associated with that, and I had to think about that. I go, "Well, what if it is ethnic cleansing? Then isn't that wrong?" This is the '90s, so I'm a young man, and I'm like, "Well, isn't that wrong?" And they're like, "It doesn't matter. Genocide is the term." And so and that was my first exposure to this type of thinking. I'm not a lawyer, but I've dealt a lot with like international law and resolutions and things. So maybe we'll talk a little bit about that difference, right? So you can ethnically cleanse someone, and there's no legal. If you Google it right now, is ethnic cleansing against the law? It'll say no. If
No.
you say is genocide against the law, they'll say yes. But maybe you
Yeah.
could, you're as a legal expert and as somebody that weighs into these waters. Maybe we'll talk about that difference and how
Yeah.
from ethnic cleansing you can get to legal elements, but there's a difference.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, maybe I'll point out that I mean it's important also to remember that words have meaning for people beyond legal categories. And so I think it's important to sometimes use language in a way that actually, what people mean something bad when they talk about ethnic cleansing. And even if there isn't an established category of a legal category of ethnic cleansing, that still is a kind of practice, a political practice that one can describe and label, and it's an odious kind of way of behavior, even if it isn't prohibited with that name under international law. The other thing specifically about that particular label of ethnic cleansing is that the thing that people are referring to when they say ethnic cleansing is definitely prohibited under international law. It's just that the relevant provisions of international law use different terms. So there's a prohibition on forcibly transferring people. You can't move them from in occupied territory, for example, from the place where they live somewhere else. Unfortunately, in Palestine, we see that happening all the time. You're not allowed to deport people. You can't move them from their country outside to exile them. That's these are violations of the laws of war or IHL, and they also can entail war crimes in certain circumstances. We just wouldn't. So, for the purposes of the law, you wouldn't label them as ethnic cleansing. There is a possibility also that a category of ethnic cleansing will crystallize as a legal category because it describes something that is there's an additional element there that I think these notions of things like deportation and forcible transfer don't quite capture. And that's the idea that you're moving people, a whole ethnic group, in order to make their land available to another ethnic group. There's something added, there's a kind of added level of odiousness to that, and that's not captured in those legal categories. I suppose that's why people in that context were referring to genocide, because genocide is a crime where you do something to a group because of their group identity. Except genocide is, I mean, it's ultimately it's the complete destruction of that group. They
Right.
are correct that ethnic cleansing could be an element of genocide. So one of the ways to destroy a group is to just move them from to destroy their culture, their connections to the culture, and yeah. Anyhow, that's a bit of background around that.
Yeah.
And yeah, just to
And
say, you see a lot of this kind of these struggles about labels in the context
right.
because labels have a lot of weight and people want to use them. And yeah, that,
Keywords and how they move, and so it's like there's been cultural genocide, right? That's I don't know, is that
yeah,
I don't know if that's a crime, but there's where you're not allowed to learn their language, and not allowed, stuff like that is our terms,
right.
and so it's tough because there's all these keywords floating around,
Yeah,
and everybody's
right.
kind of everybody is weighing into them and using them, like the word in America where fascist is being thrown around.
Yeah,
Everybody's a fascist. So and it's like, well, okay, what is a fascist? What is fascism? We start kind of way into that. But one of the terms that's thrown around is apartheid. And you come from an apartheid state.
yeah,
You
yeah,
were born in an apartheid state. And
yeah,
we just talked about how your family came here and they're like, oh, well, it was kind of apartheid light in the 80s, but now it's blossomed into something.
yeah,
And so I got into a little bit of trouble writing an article about how Afghan women are functionally stateless, even though they're not legally stateless. And I mentioned it in the articles, the tagline, that it's not legal statelessness, but it's functional. And because they couldn't get IDs, they can't go to school, they don't have access, they can't walk in public, right? So without escorts and all kinds of other things. And then so I started thinking about this. I was like, is Israel an apartheid state? Or is it a key term that is used for a situation that's hard to describe?
yeah. So, I mean, apartheid is an example of one of those labels that people are using because it calls to mind a kind of political regime that was rejected by the whole world, and there's some
Yeah.
power in using that label. So my own approach initially, when it was applied, I mean, Palestinians have been saying Israel is maintaining an apartheid regime, for decades. So in the 80s, when we moved, there were already Palestinians who were saying that, and certainly in the years that followed. And initially, in the 80s, I was too young, but when I was a young adult and kind of learning about these concepts, I would have rejected that labeling. But increasingly, both because I know more, but also because the reality has evolved, I think it's increasingly difficult to say that this isn't, at least in the territories, the occupied Palestinian territories, which are controlled by Israel, to say that there isn't, that this doesn't fall within the formal legal category of apartheid, never mind kind of concept that perhaps people are trying to evoke when they say that. So, I mean, apartheid, I don't want to get into all and I probably don't remember the exact definitions in different conventions, but basically it's this idea that one group dominates another group or oppresses another group for the purpose of kind of establishing domination over that group.
Like a like a class system,
Yeah.
but
Well,
structurally, you know,
yeah. I mean, so this in South Africa it was around this notion of race, and there's been some debate about whether the kind of policies that Israel enforces in Palestine fit in that kind of rate because Israel would say Palestinians are not being the rules, the different rules that we establish for Palestinians are not motivated by some kind of racial outlook, but rather because there's a legitimate security concern, and we're trying to. I don't know how. I mean, that might have been plausible at one point, but when you actually look at what happens on the ground, you have two people because of the Israeli settlements in the occupied territories. They're living right next to each other often, and the same regime is enforcing different laws for these different groups. One is much more protective than the other. So Israelis benefit from a legal regime that you would find in like liberal democracies with all kinds of protections for civil liberties, etc. Palestinians are subjected to military law, the law of an occupying power. And so, I mean, you can have an event that's particularly pronounced when there's a clash, which there often is, between an Israeli settler and a Palestinian. If the Israeli military or police intervene in such a case, um, besides the fact that they're going to exhibit a kind of favoritism towards the Israelis just because of their ethnic kind of, or because of they just affiliate with them more, even formally, even if they're playing by the books that are in place would establish that for the Israelis involved in this incident, say they were throwing stones at one another, there's a host of protections that would be applicable. You couldn't just arrest them. You'd have to go through all these procedures and they'd go to a civilian court and there'd be all these protections for them. The Palestinian is going to be thrown in detention. The case will be adjudicated before a military court with these much more draconian rules. It's going to play out in a really different way. That's by the books. The reality is even worse than that because the soldiers and the policemen on the ground don't do anything to the settlers and they behave in this very oppressive way towards Palestinians. And that's just a little example. This is very structural.
right.
It's a system that differentiates between people because of their group identity. So to my mind, at least let's put it this way, there's a very strong case to be made that this label of apartheid could be applied in
And,
the.
and it's not just with some stuff like conflict. There's stuff like access to highways and streets,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
or
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
access to your home is, can be circuitous if you're a Palestinian. There's certain
Yeah.
things like that that are just, checkpoints, right? The idea of
No,
going
absolutely.
from work to A to B, right? There's certain, if you have an emergency, I can't remember. I was interviewing some people from, both sides of the camps, and we were chatting about how just access to an ambulance is, it could be the delays that it takes for an ambulance to get to you could be something. Permits for housing, right? The ownership,
You're right. It's
ownership.
every level of life, really. I mean,
Yeah,
I mean, even if you look at a map, so I mean, if you look at the road map for the West Bank, it doesn't make any sense. You have all these intersecting roads, and the only you have to understand it, you have to understand that there's a separate road system. One's catering for the settlements in the occupied territory, connecting them to Israel and to one another.
yeah,
The highways, modern roads, very efficient. Palestinians can't access those roads.
right.
Formally, there's a security justification for this, but these are roads in Palestine. They're in the West Bank, not in Israel. Palestinians can't access them. And so the argument would be say this is kind of separate but equal because they do have alternative roads, but it's not equal because their road is this old broken down the road that goes all the way around. It takes 4 times longer to travel through. Plus, you have to go through checkpoints, etc. It's these two peoples living right next to each other, experiencing completely different conditions of life at every level, as you were saying.
Yeah, because I don't think people realize that difference, and so and then there's like sort of I was in Rafah, and the Israelis were showing me this like modern city that they and Rafah is now nothing, right? It's trouble, but it was all this ideal modern sort of master plan community, and the problem is that there was no one there. It was really funny. It was like this, and so I go, well, when are the people going to move in? And they're like, well, we're showcasing it now. And I go, well, when are people going to move in? Yeah, I was just asking a simple question. There was all these apartment buildings that were empty and storefronts and stuff like that, and the challenge is that in an apartheid state, you're kind of struggling between maintaining this sort of class system and maintaining this different
Yeah.
privileged system while you're interacting with the population you're trying to oppress. So is it structural statelessness? Is it for functional statelessness? I'm just bringing that up because, or is it fit the definition of apartheid state?
Yeah, I mean, I think the same thing can fit different labels. So, I mean, I think the apartheid, you can make a very strong case that,
As an American, they would always say that the Palestinians are stateless. When I was growing up, I'm
yeah,
50. So
yeah,
that was I don't I associate apartheid states with like obviously South Africa. So like
yeah,
so my term I grew up with was statelessness, right? And it was so difficult. And all the Palestinians would say statelessness, and I that was the term that was floating around in my head. But it's not. There's a difference between legal and functional. And then I go,
yeah,
so from a legal definition, is apartheid? Is it something that
yeah.
does it fit the legal definition as from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does fit the legal
Okay.
perspective. I mean, that I should say is my personal, as an organization, the organization I work with hasn't taken a formal position on that, but
Okay.
my personal view is that, and I suppose it's informed also by my own experiences as a South African. So it's not the same as South Africa, but these legal labels are not designed just to fit an exact replica
Right.
of it. So and in essence, there's enough there that's the same for that category to fit. We have done actually the organization that I worked with, the International Humanitarian Law Center. We did do an analysis with all kinds of experts about whether you can have apartheid in occupied territory because Israel.
Right.
This is a different reality. We treat people in the Palestinian territory differently because it's not part of Israel; it's occupied territory. The same people who are making this argument are also trying to annex Palestine. So that's a side issue. But in this analysis, what the experts came out with was basically that while apartheid in South Africa existed in the same state, you can have an apartheid regime in occupied territory. So it's both occupied territory in the sense that it isn't Israel, this is foreign territory under Israeli control, but it's the same regime, the same state that's controlling the territory and the people within this territory and subjecting them to different norms. So, I mean, if somebody would want to say this, the apartheid doesn't fit for that, then I mean, it's still the phenomenon is still the same. It's
Something's
still
happening still,
something
right?
really bad is happening here, and I think apartheid fits. If you want to call it something else, that's fine. Now, statelessness, I mean, that's also true. Occupied territory, by the way. So the idea is that Palestine, at least not the historical Palestine, which is now largely Israel, but at least the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, that's been recognized as territory where the Palestinian people is entitled to establish a state, where their right to self-determination can be realized. That's very frustrating for many Palestinians because that's a small part of historical Palestine. But for many Israelis, that's outrageous, that idea that that there'll be a Palestinian state there. For the time being, while they have a recognized right to establish that state, and the International Court of Justice in July 24 ruled or expressed an opinion in an advisory opinion that Israel's presence in that territory is unlawful and that Israel must leave as rapidly as possible. But in the meantime, the reality is that while they have this kind of right to a state in that territory, they don't have it. It's not. It hasn't been realized. It's still under foreign control. With respect to Gaza, the foreign control is really complicated now because it's partly Israeli control, and now you've got this board of peace that Trump set up with other states, and I'm not
Sure.
there who's going to control it, but not Palestinians.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's so when it comes to the the government, the government of Israel, the Knesset, right? So and which is the governing body, and how is dignity defined? Because I know there's no constitution, right? There's no it all goes to a lot of people don't realize that there's no constitution, so everything goes to the courts, right? And then the courts arbitrate on what is and what isn't, and then it becomes law. So how I mean, how is that? How are definitions, legal definitions? How do they work within the structure of
Yeah.
government for this idea of dignity,
Yeah.
which is I don't. Which is with part of the Jewish, as we mentioned earlier, we established part of the Jewish tradition, part of the Jewish legal structure within the faith.
Yeah.
Dignity is there, right? So it's
Yeah.
present. So how is that? How is that materialized within the Israeli government?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a source of a lot of tension, constitutional tensions, actually. So, Israel doesn't have a constitution, but it does have these what are referred to as basic laws. So, these are laws that are understood to be chapters towards uh, a constitution that's supposed to crystallize at some point in the future. And rather controversially, from the perspective of at least the Israeli right wing, at one point, the Israeli Supreme Court, at a point in its history when it was a more liberal court than it is now, it's a bit like the US, um, that court decided that these basic laws have a kind of constitutional status.
Mm.
So they have a normative superiority over other rules. And I'm mentioning this because one of the most fundamental basic laws is a law that actually is called human dignity and liberty, but the basic law on human dignity and liberty. So
Oh yeah.
it's a kind of principle that's been enshrined into the emerging constitution of the state, and the court has insisted that it has a right to rule that a law that contradicts these basic laws is unlawful.
Right.
The Knesset doesn't like that because it's a challenge to its authorities. That's
Sure.
at the crux of a really heated kind of constitutional crisis that we have in Israel, and Netanyahu's government is really pushing to change the composition of the court, to change that whole reality so that the Knesset will be able to establish any law it wants, including ones that seem to contradict this notion of human dignity, and no court will be able to say this law is unconstitutional and it's annulled, it's void. But at the moment, we still have, in theory, the possibility to refer to this concept of human dignity as a constitutional concept, and it's defined in the law. And actually, a law that contradicts this concept could be pronounced unlawful. Certainly, a policy of the government. The executive can't do things that there's. This is not necessarily helpful for Palestinians for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, these notions, as everyone who does law knows, I mean, they're very flexible. You have an abstract concept, you apply it to
Sure.
reality. There's a lot of room for lawyers to do all sorts of things. But in this case, on top of that, this is a law that is applied for in Israel. So it applies to in Israel's own territory and with respect to Israeli nationals in settlements. But Palestinians in the occupied territory are subject to a different regime. That's occupied territory. In occupied territory, you're supposed to maintain the law that existed in the occupied territory beforehand, and you can add military law, which Israel has over the decades expanded, but it's very different from these constitutional principles. And it's harder for Palestinians to rely on this notion of human dignity to kind of gain some protection from the Israeli executive. And beyond that, the argument that sort of follows through all the time with almost everything, every practice that Israel pursues that's harmful towards Palestinians is a security argument. And I mean, there is some basis. I mean, there are security threats. It's a violent context. There's confrontations. There is a need for Israel to defend its nationals from potential threats.
Right.
Concern is, though, under the guise of security, so much more is being done that overruns human dignity without justification. But anyhow, that's a little bit of background about how this unfolds in context.
Yeah, it's difficult because we get a lot of people, will talk about this, that there's all this vacillation between Israel proper, right, where you have these sort of
Yeah.
unmovables, right, and then you have the occupied territories. You have martial law or military law, and so here you'll have arguments say, well, it's an internal struggle, and go, well, the West Bank and Gaza are supposed to be autonomous, independent entities that are supposed to be for the Palestinians, but they're under martial law, right? So you get into this point where think it's not an internal conflict, but it is an internal conflict. If it was an internal conflict, then you could execute this right for dignity theoretically, but because it's an occupied territory, you can't, right? So there's all these real complications, and everybody likes to everybody kind of decides what the situation is for their argument, at least here.
Can I just, yeah, I mean, I do feel I have to point out that the situation in Israel proper is so where Israeli law is enforced by Israel is far from perfect. I mean, this constitutional crisis that I was talking about before is happening in Israel. Palestinians, many Palestinians have live in Israel, have Israeli citizenship. So Israelis would refer to them as Arab Israelis, but Palestinians, these were people who live in what used to be Palestine, and they define themselves as Palestinians. They're Palestinians who are Israeli nationals, and they would say, I think with much justification, that they don't feel that they're living in a state where they're recognized as equals. Their situation is better than Palestinians in the occupied part of historical Palestine. Uh, they're formally under the same rules as the Jewish population in Israel, but the practice is very different. You have I mean, you were talking about ethnic cleansing before, so they're Bedouin communities in the south of Israel. These are communities in Israel, and they are constantly facing threats of displacement. The argument is that their property isn't registered, which of course it isn't. They're Bedouin, so they didn't register. But they have these are their lands that they would say for centuries, these have been the lands in which they've lived. And now they're being told, well, this isn't registered and we want to build a city and you're not welcome to live here, so we're moving you out. So these kinds of things are happening. So it's far from perfect even within Israel, but there are layers to this.
Yeah. I mean, there's also good stuff. I mean, I'm going to sound like a propagandist now. I know I'm going to get hammered on this because when I was in Israel, there's Sharia courts, right? And there are Sharia judges, and you can go to the civil courts for whatever issue you have, but you can also use the Sharia court. So it's a strange blend of different peoples and things that are happening, which is good, but then you have these other elements that are becoming more and more prevalent, especially as things move into a more extremist environment. I mean, with the work you do, how do you? We do our strategic plan every year. We do our strategic and tactical plan, and you talk with Maureen, right? My number one. We're chatting back and forth. I'm like, what can we do this year? I was like, we could do like a few things that are like sweet dreams, lollipops, and moonbeams, but what is it that we can actually have an impact and where we can actually say we got it done or have a reasonable expectation of getting it done within the organization you're working at, right? The Humanitarian Law Center. Like you say, okay, what's a daily or weekly win? What's the plan of the organization to get to that point of dignity and to leverage faith communities to collaborate and cooperate with each other so that you can actually impact vulnerable populations within this structure?
So, I mean, if we were only going to aspire, I mean, if we would consider it a successful week only when we actually succeeded in ensuring respect for this body of law that's being violated, so there were no violations and the communities were protected, then we'd have very, very few success stories. I mean, the challenge. So, I should say the IHL Center. I mean, IHL is International Humanitarian Law is the name for a field of law that's also referred to by military people, for example, as the law of armed conflict or the laws of war, which is perhaps a better reflection of the nature of this body of law. It's a body of law that seeks to establish certain restrictions on behavior in situations of armed conflict and occupation. So it actually has quite low expectations because these are violent situations where bad things happen, and it just wants to establish certain protections, for example, for civilians, for people in occupied territory, for the population. So, but even those protections are really difficult to secure, and we don't have a direct engagement with the main duty bearers. So in our case, it's sometimes various Palestinian armed groups, but mainly the Israeli authorities. We don't have direct engagement with them. We certainly don't have direct influence over them. So what we try to do is to mobilize other actors, more powerful actors that do have influence over the parties, in particular over Israel. That's really, for the most part, third states. So states that have a strong, at least a formal rhetorical commitment to the rule of international law, a law-based order, the values that underpin international law. So they say that they're committed to these values. That means that they also have a duty to ensure respect for human rights law, for humanitarian law, for the laws of war. And so we try to push them to do that. So we do this analysis about what's going wrong. We point out the violations, the gap between sort of is and ought, and try to close that gap or to get these other actors to close that gap. The most influential third state for our context, and actually for most places in the world, is the United States. But that's pretty much a lost cause for us now, unfortunately. We don't have more. We have, I would say, as little traction with the present U.S. administration as we would have with the Israeli authorities. Um, in fact, the Israeli authorities at least still pay some kind of lip service to international law. The present U.S. administration doesn't seem to bother with even with that. So that's really frustrating. And so it ends up being um, yeah, sort of a list of the usual suspects, certain, so the EU and its members, certain other European states, Canada, Australia, Brazil, actually
Yeah.
now, that could fluctuate. A few other states who are committed to these rules, and then other actors, UN organizations. We're part of a network of civil society actors who push for change, and the changes that we actually manage to secure are limited. I mean, part of it's just an effort in a way to create some friction so that things don't get worse. Even that's a success story, and you can pinpoint to an individual case here or there where you manage to help one family or another. But I mean, we've been doing this work and watching Gaza being turned into, being flattened, and at least,
Do you are
yeah.
you are you focusing just like in Gaza and the West Bank, or do you deal with issues within Israel proper?
So, I mean, we deal with issues that international humanitarian law would address. So that would be occupied
Gaza.
territory, conflict,
Yeah.
conflict that happens on both sides. So, Israel destroyed Gaza, but there were also rockets landing in the middle of Tel Aviv,
Right. Yeah.
where I live, etc. And so, and those were also violations. And the recent hostilities began with an attack by Hamas-led armed groups that was completely in violation of, I mean, the way they behaved in this attack, killing civilians. And we saw, unfortunately, we had to look at all the images of people documenting themselves, killing people who were obviously civilians and doing all these other horrendous things.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's not as though we have one side here who's kind of respects the purity of arms and is perfect. There were violations on both sides, and we document both of them. The more powerful side, in this case, Israel, has more capacity to influence, well, cause harm to the other side. So most of the time, we end up speaking about Israel. But on the 7th of October and the months after that, we were going through, this shocking kind of documentation of all these violations and pointing out, I mean, basically, we would look through the list of practices that are defined as war crimes, and pretty much every single one of them had been
Yeah.
committed by those armed groups, and then in the months that followed by Israel in Gaza.
Interesting. I mean, it's so what would be a like what's a good day?
Yeah,
Like
I
like
don't remember.
what's that?
I don't remember.
Yeah, well,
The honest answer, really.
I mean, we deal with this all like we're doing our impact report last
Yeah,
year, and we were just finishing it up at the year end, and I'm just trying to think, okay, did we, I'm
yeah,
like, did we have impact? Did we,
yeah,
even at the smallest level, how
yeah,
do we justify the work that we're doing?
yeah,
And so and it's like, all right, did we get a win here? Did we get a win there? Did we,
yeah,
hearts and minds are one thing, right? Which is a big part
yeah,
of what we do. But then what's the impact for a
yeah,
specific person, here, or a specific family?
yeah,
I mean, what's a good, like we deal in the religious freedom space, and there's
yeah,
religious persecution has been on the rise since the ratification of IRFA, the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. It's been on the rise. It has never dipped, right? So we're always trying to struggle to find, okay, I want to celebrate a religious freedom win, right? And so one of them was the flourishing Jewish community and Christian community in the UAE, right? And the Abraham House, and the Abrahamic Accords, and so we were celebrating that, and we did a documentary called Amen, 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 which was the first time the Jewish community ever made a Torah for a special purpose
hmm,
and gave it to a Muslim ruler. And so the documentary follows the making of the Torah and giving it to Sheikh Zayed, and so and it's the most awarded multi-faith film ever, right? This was maybe 5 or 6 years ago, but and it's funny because we played that at the Ministerial in Berlin 2 years ago, and everybody goes, God, it was like the complete change of air in the room because we were celebrating a multi-faith win, like, and so like those wins are so important to buoy you up and to figure out, to because you're that's what you're going for, right? We're going for some. So what's something that that buoys you guys up, and what's a win,
Yeah.
that you guys
Well, I
have?
think we have to be pretty modest actually with especially in the last couple of years when things have been so horrible. I mean, I mentioned before that part of the effort is to influence these other actors. So, I mean,
Yeah.
for us, a win could be, and that's not just for my organization, that's for a whole community of actors who have been pushing on these issues. If in July 2024, the International Court of Justice issues an advisory opinion where it basically agrees with what we've been saying for
Mm-hmm.
for so many years that goes through all these policies and practices that Israel is pursuing in the West Bank, in the territory that it occupies. And it says not only are these practices a violation of the law of occupation, the whole occupation itself is unlawful and must end. So, I mean, that's a very small victory in the sense that the occupation is still there. The communities are still suffering that oppression. You can't be overjoyed. In fact, there's something really deeply frustrating when you sort of have the highest kind of court for international law confirming a position and the reality remains bleak. Some encouragement that you get out of that is just for, when you're part of a struggle together with others and you have these, I suppose, at least this recognition that there's justice in your cause, and that's a bit gratifying, but it's obviously not sufficient. And then at local, I'm on the board of directors of some NGOs that do work, for example, on the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel. So there have been victories at the individual level, which is really significant. Somebody gets released, and you've managed to prevent somebody from enduring terrible suffering, or I've done this work on child protection, so you can assist an individual child or family. That's very gratifying.
Right.
It's happening within a structure that remains bad and is actually deteriorating.
Sure.
So sometimes you have to stand up also for principle that our donors don't like that, we don't like it. You want to achieve the real thing. But I think it's important also to say, for somebody to point out, this is wrong, you can't do it, you have to change, even if you don't see how you can immediately bring about a change. And then the hope is that if enough people do that for enough time, eventually if everybody just says, well, we don't see how we're going to stop this, so we're just going to ignore it, or there's no point in speaking out, then then it's definitely not going to change. So these are the kind of things that we have to rely on to motivate ourselves to continue to do the work in circumstances where things seem to be getting worse and worse and worse.
And you don't have to. I don't want to insult you, embarrass myself. You don't have to answer this if you don't want to. But what if Netanyahu just came to you right now and he said, "Listen, I got the Knesset's full support.
Mhm.
I'm in the spirit of good works and dignity within the construct of your faith. I need what I have a plan. I'm going to institute a plan for the future, but I want you to design it. I want you to tell me what you want. What would you say to him if he said, and he's whatever you say to me right now, I'm going to do.
Yeah. So, I mean, if that was an idea that came up by someone in power and it was realistic, I don't even know if I could say years, it might be decades at this point. But at some point in the past, then I think probably the thing that I would have advocated for, that most of the international community is still advocating for, is some kind of just two-state solution where you'd have a Palestine and an Israel existing next to each other and in some kind of peaceful relationship between them. That doesn't seem like a realistic goal, even as a kind of pragmatic compromise now,
Yeah.
because, well, for many reasons, but the main one is that we're completely intertwined within one another now. There are about 700,000 Israelis living in what's supposed to be Palestine. And not only those are they're from the Israeli right wing, who are also disproportionately represented now in the Israeli military. So these are heavily armed people with a strong commitment to maintaining their presence there. For Palestinians also, I think the idea of, at this point, of kind of accepting a two-state solution is something that's going to be difficult to accept. So I think, and this is a bit utopian, but we have to figure out some way where we exist alongside one another, sharing this land. You need a lot of goodwill for that to happen, and that doesn't
Sure.
exist now for obvious reasons. So, I mean, there's some creative ideas that people have been promoting that I'm encouraged by a little bit. So you have these ideas where you'd have a kind of, for example, a kind of federation where,
Mm.
certain ways you'd be one state, but then you'd, for example, if you're a settler living somewhere in the West Bank, you'd vote within this federation for the government in Tel Aviv. And
Mm.
if you're a Palestinian who's exercised their right of return and lives in Jaffa, you'd vote for the government in Ramallah and you'd live, and so there,
Yeah.
I mean, this obviously sounds completely utopian now, but it's probably more practical than trying to dislodge 1 million or 700,000 people from the place where they live and denying Palestinians their right of return. And so, yeah, I mean, that's, I suppose, in an ideal world or in a world where
Yeah.
I mean, I'm trying to not, in a completely ideal world, from my perspective, we just live in one state together, but that requires a goodwill that would need to, we're far from that.
Yeah.
So being a little bit realistic, but still aspiring for some kind of creative way of sharing, I think is what we'd have to eventually do. But it's going to take a long time to get there, unfortunately, I think.
It's so difficult. I mean, even because there's separation between the West Bank and Gaza, and
Yeah.
there's Israeli real estate there. Like when people say two-state solution, there's not really a practical. Then they start saying we're going to go to then they start going backwards, 67 borders or this or that, and like,
Yeah.
so which we all know is not necessarily, it's not really realistic, particularly at this point. But
Yeah.
it was, my father was telling me a plan 2 days ago, and he's like, "This is the plan. Everybody should do this." And I go, I was like, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah. I think if you say you know the plan, then
Yeah,
you're deluding yourself. It's too
yeah,
complicated at this point. But we have to think in, I think these directions of trying to creatively think in a way that would respect the Palestinian people's demand for a right of return as much as possible, that would recognize the presence of, and by now it's generations of Israelis living in that land. I mean, many people are going to find this deeply disturbing to hear me saying this. I mean, I would prefer them not to be there. I think their presence there is unlawful. But at some point, it's going to be someone who's the third or fourth generation on that land. They've been living there. Uprooting them is not going to be easy to do at a practical level, but even as a human kind of moral level, at some point it becomes, eventually at some point, I mean, the whole of the new world is settled through all kinds of terrible deeds that were committed.
yeah.
At some point that becomes a reality, and you can't remove all the Europeans who settled in Australia and New Zealand and the US and Canada and and South America. You have to deal with the reality that was formed and find the most just solution within this
Yeah.
reality that unfolded through a lot of injustice.
It's difficult. My father's solution was to make Jerusalem an international city, and then
Yeah.
get a bunch of real estate lawyers from New York to go in there, 5 real estate lawyers to negotiate land deals, and
Yeah, I
then
mean, I think Jerusalem should be an international city, by the way. That was the plan
yeah,
initially. So
yeah,
yeah, that's a good plan, but
yeah.
there's a bit more complicated. There are more
Yeah,
elements that,
and I was like, well, you get a bunch of real estate lawyers in there, which maybe is the board of peace.
yeah,
To a certain degree. And he said, they just need to hash it out. They just need to, and everybody's going to lose, and but everything, it'd have to be acceptable to everybody because everybody loses a little
yeah.
bit, and everybody
But you
gains.
need a fair arbitrator there at the moment.
Right.
One party is far more powerful than the other, so it won't unfold in a fair way. And the main arbitrator is very much leaning in one direction. So
Yeah. I mean,
it's
General Sharon, I talked to him but when I was in Israel, and he's like, we've moved settlements. He said in the early 80s, this happened. And I don't know if you know what he was referring to.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And he
yeah,
said, we evacuated settlements. And so he goes, we know how to do that. We have done that.
yeah.
Would we do that? He goes, that's another question. But he brought that up to me, and I go, oh, I was like, I mean, just because you've done it, is that an option on the table?
This
You know,
was Ariel Sharon.
what's
The
that?
Ariel Sharon, the former, because he's
No,
one of the architects of the settlement kind
it was
of.
a general, the general.
Okay.
Yeah. So he was like, I said, oh, okay, and it was not the prime minister. And I just said, I don't know if that's possible, but I go, the fact that he said it to me, he was like,
Yeah,
that was something that if the Israeli government was willing to give that do a give and remove
Yeah.
remove the settlements, that would be open up the door for peace talks because but I'm not going to weigh in on what the government's going to do. You
Yeah,
know,
I mean, that happened at a scale. I mean, yeah, that would be nice to believe that, but that was at a scale that was too. I think you must have been talking in the early 80s when Sinai
yeah,
was evacuated. That was, I mean, that was very few people in comparison. Later on, when Israel withdrew from Gaza,
yeah,
that's caused a kind of, I mean, caused tensions within Israeli society that we still haven't, in 2005, we still haven't gotten over that. And that was just about
yeah,
5,000 people. We're talking now about.
yeah.
So.
It's much more. It's millions, right?
More people, but also it's a different attitude. I mean, Israelis are, I suppose, perhaps I shouldn't give up on this idea. I mean, I think many of those settlers would have to be uprooted probably, but I don't know if it's practical to have a solution designed about around the notion that they all have to leave. I think if you could figure out some way where they could live there under Palestinian rule without being under threat, so this
Yeah,
federation would allow for that, while Palestinians are also allowed to return to their historic, to their historical homeland
yeah,
and neutralize the concerns that that Jewish Israelis have around that. And so people are thinking about this. As I said, I mean, they're looking, for example, at the model that you have in Europe, where as a in the EU, where you can, if you're part of the EU, can live and work anywhere in the EU, but you vote for the government in your capital. So you could have, as I said, Palestinians living in Jaffa, returning to and voting for the government. But again, I mean, I sound like I'm talking about science fiction. But the problem in the context is that all the various solutions that are on the table sound like, I mean, sound so far-fetched that it's a bit
right.
discouraging to. Eventually, we're going to have to get creative.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's nuts. It's you're so I mean, it's but we're this is one of the issues that's on everybody's tongue. It's global now, both good, bad, and ugly. Like, and so there's if we're going to be pushing for something that's going to be a resolution and equitable to everyone, these conversations still need to happen, one way or another. I mean, like I said, everybody's got a plan. Everybody asked me what the plan was. I was like, the, the people that are on the ground needed to make some decisions. Like they need to have a stake in what's going on. And so a guy from New York certainly has no.
Yeah.
I have some ideas, but I'm not sure how we would institute them. But when it comes to it's late there in Tel Aviv, but to the rest of the week, what do you got going on over there? What's on your desk?
Yeah, I mean, this is Thursday, so it's coming towards an end. But I mean, the main thing that we've got on the desk at the moment is these plans for, well, there are two things. One are the plans for Gaza, which are really troubling from an international law perspective. This idea that you'd establish this new kind of international institution, this Board of Peace, with that, where, I mean, it sounds very much like a creature from the 19th century, where you had this idea that there were these peoples who couldn't kind of rule over themselves yet. They weren't ready for it. So the enlightened kind of other peoples would put on the white man's burden and come run the show for them. That kind of logic was supposed to have been a relic from the past. We now are supposed to be in a world committed to an idea of the right to self-determination of people, that they control their own destiny. Also, that was always disingenuous in the 19th century as well, and it feels very disingenuous now as well. This is about, it looks very much like profiteering off somebody else's territory and kind of managing millions of people in dire situations. So there are a lot of concerns there from an international law perspective and also from, I suppose, a political perspective. That's one focus that we're working a lot on. And then in other parts of the Palestinian territory in the West Bank, the settlement enterprise or the takeover of Palestine is being further entrenched. We're seeing, I mean, this has been going on for decades, really, the displacement, dispossession of Palestinians, but now it's just kind of the qualitatively and quantitatively getting worse. So you're seeing new legislation that Israel has introduced that would allow it to kind of change the registration of land and register land in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem as Jewish property, basically kind of keeping Palestinians off their own land. We're seeing developments now actually with the US. I mentioned before the International Court of Justice ruled in or issued an advisory opinion in 2024 saying that Israel's presence is unlawful and must end as rapidly as possible. But now the US government is going in the complete opposite direction and suggesting that it can open up, it can provide consular services in the occupied territory as though that was part of Israel. That's completely going in the opposite direction of what international law requires. By the way, I'm just thinking about the solution that I outlined before. I mean, that solution for me would definitely have to recognize the Palestinian people's right over part of this land of Palestine that's been recognized. So if settlers would still be allowed to live there, they would be living there under
Palestinian.
Palestinian rule. And I think you'd have a similar arrangement with Israel allowing Palestinians to live in its territory. And I'm pointing that out because, I mean, from an international law perspective, what the law requires is pretty simple. You just have to, Israel's not supposed to be there. Its nationals are not supposed to be there. They're all supposed to leave. So I was suggesting some ways we can kind of marriage that international law requirement with kind of a practical solution. But I think we have to be very cautious not to allow this kind of practical thinking to override the rights of Palestinians over their own land. So yeah.
Yeah, it's very tough, very tough. Well, I appreciate you taking the time and this, it's a useful conversation, just to kind of unpack some of these questions about how things are, just in a practical way. We're just, the terms that are being floated around, the idea of a two-state solution, the idea of settlements and how this all works. I appreciate you taking the time and answering, some of the hard questions. It means a lot.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for inviting me to speak here. I was really happy to do it.
Well, we'll have to have you on again, just talk about something with specificity.
Yeah, that would be great.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. Take care.